Hello, Douglas. Thank you for joining me. You are a developer at Expo, and I saw that you worked with XState at Expo, and I'm very glad you take the time to talk with me about XState. So maybe can you talk about yourself a bit?
Oh, yes. My name is Doug Lowder. I work at Expo. I've been a developer here for 2 years. I'm been involved in the React Native community for quite a few years now. I am the the developer who built the React Native Apple TV port, and I maintain the React Native TV repo for Apple TV and Android TV, and have been working on Expo for their updates feature, and now for the notifications feature, and also support TV at Expo.
Great. And so I saw in the repository of Expo that Expo Updates uses XState, and you told me that it uses XState but not in production. That was to make it possible for developers to understand the state machine you then implemented in Kotlin and in Swift. Is it right?
That is exactly right. We decided that we needed to have a state machine because our update system manages in native code over-the-air updates, and it has to be very reliable. And we decided that in order to make it as reliable as possible, and in order for the JS layer to have correct and up-to-date information on the exact state of what was happening in the native code, we needed to implement a state machine inside the updates package. So we did that, and in order to make sure that we had the right state machine without trying to iterate very slowly in native code, we built a model of that state machine in XState, which turned out to be a great idea because XState is a beautiful way of modeling very quickly different state machines in TypeScript, which is the language that we used, and manipulating those and exercising those state machines uh, on the web and in Visual Studio Code. And so several of the developers, including the other main developer that worked on Expo, were able to try out these models and suggest changes. And so we were able to very rapidly iterate and come to an agreement on exactly the model that we wanted. And just to make sure that we had a reference, we did check that model into our source tree. But that model is basically a reference for the native code that's actually used in production.
Okay. And did you use the visual tools that Stately, the company that develops currently Expo, to model the state machine, or did you stick with code for that?
We use both. Stately. We started out with Stately because it's so easy. So it's just right there on the web. Um, but in order, since we do a lot of our development on the TypeScript and JavaScript side in Visual Studio Code, it was nice to have that the plugin there that enables you to actually exercise the state machine there as well, and actually edit the state machine in Visual Studio Code and see the changes as they happen.
Yes, that's great. And I saw that you didn't use a state machine library for Kotlin and for Swift. My question, I don't really know these native languages. How is the support for state machines in Swift, in Kotlin? Why didn't you use a state machine? Could you use a state machine? That's my question. Because when I build state machines in JavaScript, I always use XState. And yes, how is it with other languages?
Um, well, because we were trying to keep our implementation as simple as possible and easy to maintain, we ended up basically building our own native classes that represented as closely as possible the state machine that we ended up with in TypeScript. So we just basically had uh, a representation of the state and the context, and just the sort of the bare minimum we needed to make things work the way we wanted. We're actually the state machine that we ended up with is actually not very complicated. It only has a few states. The most of the complexity is in the context changes. Um, so we were able to get away with not having a very complex. If we had had a more complex state machine, of course, there are native packages in both Swift and Kotlin that are designed for that, but we didn't really have to end up using those.
Yes, great. Yes, because I saw that your state machine has both transition states, events, and a context. And you, based on the transitions you allow, you take some changes to the context. This is the same thing with XState. We have the context and the states. And I saw that in your
Mm-hmm.
custom implementation, you really decide what the next shape of the context needs to be based on the current state and the event you receive. This is
Yes.
interesting. I tell that because sometimes people build state machines with their hands without using libraries, and the context is not something that should be implemented. I saw many implementation only about states and not context to get more information as you did in your implementation. So
Right.
and
Well, the state sort of represents uh, it's really represents in a sense the network state. It's the we have states representing what happens when we send out a request to see if an update is available, and then when we get the response to that, and then we have another state transition when we reach out to actually download that update, and then when we get the response to that as well. And so the context really represents whatever we're getting from the server, and so based on whatever we get from the server, we make the right changes to the context on the client.
great. Maybe we can explain a bit what the purpose of state machine and Expo updates. I did a bit of Expo development, and I'm talking about under your review. But I think Expo updates is to get a fresh JavaScript update from my application without downloading it from the App Store. Is it right or?
That is correct. Yes. As long as you only make small changes
Okay.
to, for example, the JavaScript bundle and things like that. If you make changes to native code, then you have to rebuild the app and you have to submit it to the App Store. But if you're making small changes that only touch JavaScript or TypeScript and only require that the bundle be rebuilt, then we have a system that allows that bundle to be served by the update server. And so and we have a protocol by which the application can reliably ask for whether a new update is available, and then if that update is available, it can download and it actually can reload the JavaScript engine with the new bundle.
Okay. And is it something automatic, or can developers choose to relaunch the application while the user uses it?
Both. We actually have a JavaScript API for reloading the app on the fly while the person is using it, and then uh, once you have an update that's considered the latest update, we have a database of those updates that exist on the client.
Okay.
And when the application restarts, it looks for whichever update is the latest and is known to be the right one. It launches that.
Okay. And what is this database you are talking about? Is it some SQLite or I don't know, a JSON stored in the device?
It's a SQLite database.
Okay, interesting. And
The actual the SQLite basically stores metadata about the about the updates, and then the actual update assets, including the bundles, live in the file system.
okay. And about taking update from the server, I heard about React Server components used with Expo, and my question will be: is it authorized by like the Apple Store to get updates like this from the server? Because as far as I understand, the objective of the React Server components with Expo will be to
Mm-hmm.
serve some screens from the server. I don't really know how it can apply to native applications.
Um, the answer is very complicated to that question. It depends on the application. Essentially, the you understand. I'm not officially speaking for Apple
Okay.
or Google, but my understanding of what they say in their App Store guidelines is that you can't if you make changes to the app that significantly change the functionality of it, then that requires that you rebuild the app and submit it to the App Store for review again. But if you're making changes, if you're using JavaScript and are making small changes, then that's okay. Again, the only way you will really know what's okay is if you actually submit your app to the App Store, and they will tell you if it's okay or not.
Okay.
That's Apple and Google are always the source of truth for things like that.
Great. It's great to see some improvements in the native land like this. Um, I've been using the Hey email service for a long time now, and I think their native applications relies on some kind of server-side things in the iOS application, and I didn't really know if it
Right.
was allowed or not. But if they were doing it,
I don't know. It's certainly a topic of active debate. I
yes,
mean, if you think about it, any application that's a web application can be updated completely on the fly. It's just you get whatever's on the server at all times. So this is really sort of the same model in that sense. Uh, but uh, you have to basically use good judgment and make sure that you're following all of the guidelines that Apple and Google give you from their app stores.
great. And about state machines. How did you learn about state machines? Specifically, I've been using them, I've been discovering them thanks to XState. I didn't learn about them previously. So, how did you? Is it something you knew for a long time, or something you discovered recently? Um, State machines,
I
yes.
had worked with very simple state machines in the past because a long time ago, I worked on embedded systems, operating system work with Linux running on different types of embedded systems and things like that, and even code that was actually running on the bare processor. And in those cases, you have to be very careful how you design your code and sort of check all paths that the code could follow. And state machines turn out to be very useful for modeling code like that and making sure that it can't break no matter what happens. I think that the what XState provides is a lot more complex and sophisticated than the stored state machines that I was working with back then. Uh, but in terms of the basic concepts of always making sure that you follow the rules and all state, you can never be in any you can never be in any state other than one of the states you've defined. That's a good model to have to make sure that your code doesn't break. And it was nice to see that XState had done a really good job of building that in a modern language like TypeScript, which is very easy for React Native developers to use. So it was actually a very nice tool for us.
What I love with XState is that it doesn't simply allow developers to create state machines, but it follows the state charts recommendation. The specification is
Yes.
SCXML, and we can build compound states, parallel states, things really more
Mm.
sophisticated and not necessarily useful for every project. But yes, I can build anything I want, any kind of I think diagram or system I want with XState, from the simple one to the more complex. And
Yeah.
yes, this is something
Yeah.
I like.
We barely scratched the surface of what it can do for our project. But what the nice thing about XState is that it's designed so that you can build something simple very quickly, which was exactly what we needed.
Yes. And what do you think about using state machines, or more specifically XState, in userland code in React Native applications?
I think um, I could see it being extremely useful for certain types of applications. And if I ever come across a use case that requires a state machine actually in the JavaScript bundle, that will be the first place I look. Will be XState for sure.
Yes, great. One thing I like to implement with XState in my React Native application is authentication, because I know that with the most modern Expo versions, there is now the Expo router to use file-based structure to define pages. But previously, I've been using React navigation, and you had to declare the routes based on the authentication state or other things. And I like to use
Yes.
XState to control all those authentication flows that can become complex the more you add features.
Yeah. I could see that being very useful, particularly if you have more complex authentication setups. So yeah, I do agree that Expo Router has done a good job of solving some of those issues. It's sort of a state machine in a sense itself. Everything the routes actually sort of define state. You can never be in anything other than one of the routes that's allowed. So it it that's I'm still I'm actually been spending a lot of time learning how to build things with Expo Router recently in the past few months, and I'm really liking the way that it sort of makes sure that you stay with you basically know exactly in all the states or the routes that the system can be in.
Great. And so, do the React server components will be inside the Expo router, or is it something more agnostic? Is it tied to Expo router?
Um, that is not something that that's something that's still under development, to be honest. I'm going to wait and let the developers who are working on that
Okay,
make sure that they know all the answers to your questions, and they will. There's some good talks actually. Evan Bacon just came out with a good talk on that subject. That was part of App.js, and I think they just released that as a YouTube video.
great. I will link to it in the description of the video. So,
Yeah.
and I saw that you did a lot of work about Apple TV and React Native. Can you talk
Yes.
about that a bit, please?
Uh, that's been something I've been working on since 2016,
Okay.
2017, and I'm currently maintaining the repo that it's basically a fork of React Native Core, where we've added the support for Android TV and Apple TV. It's basically uh, a f- some. It's mostly the same code. It's mostly iOS. The same code is on the core. About 90% of the Apple TV code and iOS code are in common. But there are some features that have to be added, particularly for managing how you navigate around the screen with a remote control, and some other changes that happen when you move to those platforms. And we've been maintaining that as a separate repo for the last few years now. More recently, I've made some changes at Expo so that Expo fully supports TV. Most of the core Expo packages now support TV, including the video packages, uh, the audio, even Expo Router works. The only major package that doesn't work on TV right now is the Expo Dev client,
Okay.
I would say.
And what kind of application can we port to TVs? I didn't do that, so I don't really know what kind of application must go to Apple TV or Android TV.
Um, Obviously, most of the people who are interested in the TV platforms are interested in streaming
Okay,
audio and video. But it's also good for anything that requires a large display.
okay,
For example, I've seen financial applications
okay,
that do large graphics, of your portfolios on the TV, and shopping apps, various other things. There's quite a few apps out there.
okay,
It's not as popular, obviously, as the phones or web, but there are there are people, particularly, um, as I said, large streaming platforms do like to have apps running on TVs.
Okay.
And it's also a bit complicated because in addition to the repo that I run for Apple TV and Android TV, there's many TV platforms where you have to build things as web apps. And so there's a large amount of effort going into making web apps that can run on these TVs.
Okay.
And many of those, and obviously many of those people use Expo Web tools for that.
Yes. That's a great use case for Expo Web. So,
Yeah.
and do those other kinds of TVs do use uh, hold JavaScript runtimes, or are they up to date and we can use recent JS features on them?
The answer is both. There's many TVs that are modern, where we actually can use modern HTML and Java and JavaScript, and there's many that are not. There's many TVs out there that are 10 years old or more, and supporting them gets to be a challenge,
Yeah.
as you might imagine.
Okay. Yes, because you have to support all TVs that have been released 10 years ago and that can still receive those kind of applications.
Yeah,
So yes, I can understand that it's quite a bit hard to support.
yeah, exactly.
Yes. And is VS Code able to run on a TV? Because I know that developers like to have big screens. Maybe we can use VS Code on a TV to code.
I don't think it does. I've never tried it. Um, the most I've ever done is I have a really big screen Android TV that I have that has a bunch of different HDMI inputs, and one of them is for my development machine, so I can actually see all my code on the TV, and then I have another input that's for the Apple TV, and then it also runs Android TV, so I can. So, but I have to switch back and forth between all those different things.
Great. So yes, do you have something to say about state machines? We didn't say yet, or do you think
No,
it's good?
I I think that we had that was um, a good summary of where we are with updates, why we use state machines there, and I think as you say, XState is a really good, very sophisticated package. Anyone wanting to use state machines for React or React Native should definitely try XState out. I think for sure.
That's a great summary. Thank you. Where can we find your work online, Doug?
You can find me at GitHub. Doug Lowder is my username, and you can find me at the React Native TV repo, and on the React Native contributors Discord and in the Expo Discord.
Great. So thank you a lot, Doug, for your time. It was a pleasure to talk with you, and
Likewise.
have a good night because it's been late at your home. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. It was great.